Hey everyone, it's Joe Kral with the Society of St. Sebastian, and again, welcome to Pro Life University. We're going to finalize our series on anti-coercion legislation. This week, we're going to primarily focus on the legislation itself and how it moves towards a culture of life. So, in part one, we talked a little bit about the history, especially that relationship between coercion and abortion. We went back in ancient history to see that this was something that was done in Rome and in the times of the Greeks and so forth. And we see a clear history of how men have coerced women into getting an abortion or even doing infanticide. It's a well documented story, and you can open many history books that actually focus on this particular phenomenon as well. Not to mention, in part two, we talked about the theology, or rather the sin of coercion. And so this week we're going to conclude by diving into anti-coercion legislation and talking about how it leads to a culture of life. First, I want to say that I'm using a model bill that is produced by Americans United for Life. Here you go, right here. And as you can see, it says the Coercive Abuse Against Mothers Prevention Act. This is just kind of the standard piece of anti-coercion legislation that we would see in many states. And just to let you know, roughly 18 states have passed bills that deal with anti-coercion, or excuse me, 18 states have passed legislation that prohibit the coercion of women with respect to an abortion. So it's important to note that many states have already begun to take the initiative to do this sort of thing. So it's important to kind of understand what's going on. Now, first thing I really kind of want to focus on is obviously this bill goes, and every bill does this as well, is you have a list of definitions. And this bill, in this particular model legislation, obviously defines what coercion is and actually gives some prime examples of what coercion is. So some of the things that you can talk about is like if someone threatens to pull away a woman's scholarship because she's pregnant, that would be a form of coercion. Threatening not to pay child support would be a form of coercion. Threatening to kick somebody out of their home would be a threat of coercion. It goes through many types of different examples to show exactly what they mean by this term coercion. And then it gets into three important parts, if you will. After you've defined it, you get into the actual meat of the bill in many respects. And so obviously the big part, the one that we primarily focus on, is the coercion itself. And so it's clear that if someone is making overtones that are very coercive, right, that are actively trying to coerce this woman into getting an abortion, then that would be illegal, right, under the law. Now, obviously, how do you come about and understand, and how do they report such a thing? It's not as if a woman's necessarily going to go to jail or go to the police station and report that someone's coercing her to do this. Well, part of that actually relies on the abortion clinic itself. So in some respects, and this gets into the second part of the bill, when the woman comes in, she can see signs. One of the big things about especially the AUL model is that they are clear that noticeable signs must be posted that inform women that coercion and coercing her into getting an abortion is wrong, right? So you've got to have posted signs where they come in, they see it, and so forth. The other aspect, really kind of the third important aspect of this bill, is the duty of the abortionist as a mandatory reporter, right? Meaning if he witnesses a crime, such as sexual abuse and so forth, as a doctor, he is supposed to report that sort of thing. And here we see kind of an extension, if you will, of that sort of thing that this doctor must do. And here it's a coercion. The doctor literally physically has to ask the woman if she has been coerced into an abortion. If she says yes, he has to report it. Right? That's important to note right there. If he fails to do that, obviously he can be, convicted of a crime. So this is important to note. And at that point in time, another waiting period literally kicks in, if you will, where she's given information about alternatives that are available to her, legal information regarding, what are the legal duties of the father and so forth. And she has a 24-hour waiting period at that point in time. And so in many respects, this is an important sort of thing because, as I've stated earlier, I believe in both part 1 and part 2, 64%, roughly 2/3 of women who go in for an abortion feel pressured into doing an abortion. And many of these women are very much coerced along the lines, as I mentioned earlier in this video. So it's interesting to note, right, that this sort of legislation helps stop that sort of illicit or immoral behavior, right? So that's very important. So here we've got the meat of the bill. So let's just briefly cover what the bill is going to do. How does this bill lead towards a culture of life? Now, as someone who is an ethicist by nature, right? I should say an ethicist by profession, really. When I had to look at various bills and analyze them and so forth, I obviously had to look at, this idea of the principle of incrementalism as espoused by John Paul II. All right, does an evil existing law already exist that allows the evil to take place? And that's true. We do have that here in this situation. And the obvious case here in the U.S. is obviously Roe v. Wade, right? That legalized abortion. Abortion is legal, and obviously Doe v. Bolton, you can throw that in there as well. And that allowed it up to birth for literally any reason at all. So we have the evil law that's in place. Now, how does this piece of legislation limit the harm? That's an important question. Well, since Roe v. Wade, Doe v. Bolton became the law of the land in 1973, one of the things that was allowed to take place as a result of this is coercion. And that's just one of the many evils. And so what this legislation does is obviously laser focus on this particular situation by honing in on this practice of coercion and saying, no, that's wrong. And in that respect, it limits the harm. That coercion is no longer going to be legally acceptable under this law if it's passed and then signed into law and enacted. So we see that the evil laws in existence, we know that the evil law allows for coercion, and we know that this bill will limit the harm by making that coercion illegal, right? So we see how it's limiting the harm, right? Now, the big question is, how is this going to push public morality towards an acceptance of a culture of life? This is kind of the big question here, right? This is kind of the big sort of ethical, metaphysical sort of question. How do we obtain a culture of life? How does this take that important step forward? And what I can really say is one, it becomes crystal clear that coercing a woman into an abortion is immediately wrong, right? That's an important thing to know, right? Some people might simply understand very clearly that, if you're coercing her, you're not really allowing her to express her freedom. Now, in many of these cases, we can understand that, pragmatically speaking, that if these women don't feel pressured, or if they know that the pressure is no longer there, they are going to probably be more than willing to have these children if they know their legal rights, that they know that the father has to take care of them, if they know that their school is not going to remove their scholarship, if they know that their employer is not going to be able to fire them, right? They're more than likely going to have these children. Why? Because the law simply says no. And as a result, we see the value of life, and people begin to see the value of life. That just because it kind of interferes with whatever you want, you do not have the right to sit there and try to pressure a woman into having an abortion. And that's the immediate step that we take in this place, because it begins to show this idea that life, especially in this case, unborn life is a good. And we achieve this good. We begin to get a better sense of this idea of the virtue of justice, all right? That which is owed to another. Not only are we giving the mother what is owed to her, all right? We're giving to the child what's owed to them, all right? We owe the mother to let her play out her responsibilities. She is now a mom since she's pregnant. She has a duty to provide for this young child and to ensure that this young child is provided for. And this law helps people recognize that particular sort of reality, that ethical reality, if you will. Well, anyway, I hope this kind of helps you get a better view of what's going on with anti-coercion legislation. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to comment below. I'll be glad to answer them as always. And again, thank you so much for what you do. Give us a big thumbs up. We always appreciate it. And I hope you have a blessed weekend. God bless.